Please join me in welcoming to the Distinctive Voices podium, Dr. William Thompson.
Well, thank you. It's really quite an honor to be here, particularly as part of this Distinctive Voices series. I'm clearly the least distinguished of the speakers in this series, but it's quite an honor to be included with the likes of E.O. Wilson and Bruce Albert, Donald Kennedy, and so on. When I showed the lineup of speakers to one of my colleagues, he said, well, it's kind of like a rock concert where they have to bring in a local act kind of as a warm-up for the main attraction. Which you know, but all I can say is, even if that's true, I'm still very honored to be part of this series. My talk tonight is particularly relevant for a series sponsored by the National Academy of Sciences, because I'll be focusing primarily on a report of the National Research Council that came out earlier this year in February on forensic sciences. A report that startled a lot of people because it suggested that CSI had, in effect, gone awry, that there were some serious problems in the field of forensic science. So I'm talking tonight about what the report said, what those problems are or might be, and what might be done about it. The public perceptions of forensic science have largely been shaped by television. We all know these folks and these folks. And media programs like the CSI series have shaped how we think about forensic science. Certainly it's viewed generally by people as highly credible, unbiased, extremely valuable for solving crime. Not only do these folks seem to have the capability of solving crimes with unerring accuracy, they look good while doing it. So it was a surprise to many when, in February of this year, the National Research Council issued a report called Strengthening Forensic Science in the United States, A Path Forward, that offered a rather scathing assessment of the field of forensic science. Now, it was couched in rather diplomatic terms. You notice they talk about strengthening forensic science, but the implication is there's need to strengthen it. And if you read it carefully, the evaluation of forensic science as a field is pretty dire. There are suggestions that entire disciplines in forensic science, particularly in the areas known as pattern matching disciplines, rest on a deficient scientific foundation. That procedures for interpretation that are widely used throughout forensic science are lacking in rigor. Inadequate efforts have been made by forensic scientists to avoid error and bias, and that analysts routinely testify with unwarranted certainty about their conclusions. That is, telling juries more than the science will support. All right. Having made that sweeping critique, the NRC report called for some rather significant, and I will call them systemic changes. The report concluded that the problems in forensic science are rooted in the institutional structure of the field, that the way that we organize forensic science in this country is not working, and that we need to make significant changes in how forensic science is organized, administered, and structured. In particular, the report calls for the creation of a new federal agency, which it suggested be called the National Institute of Forensic Science, or NIFS, which would have the responsibility for overseeing and administering funding forensic science in the country. Another recommendation that was startling to people is that public crime laboratories be removed from the control of police agencies and prosecutors' offices. Currently in this country, most crime labs are operated by police departments. In California, it's mostly at the county level, and in most counties, it's police departments. 3 California counties have crime labs operated by district attorneys' offices. Orange County is kind of a hybrid. The sheriff has traditionally operated it, although right now the district attorney is making an effort to take over at least part of the lab. But the suggestion from the National Research Council is get law enforcement out of the administrative function, have forensic science administered as freestanding agencies out of law enforcement control. And they argue there's a need to create new university-level graduate education programs for forensic science, to create what it called a scientific infrastructure that will create a supply of well-trained scientists to do CSI kind of work, and will create a research infrastructure to do the kind of validation studies that, according to the report, are missing. All right? So this is a pretty dramatic set of suggestions. And what I'll be talking about tonight is what's the basis for these suggestions? Let's look a little more deeply into it and ask what really are the problems, and how about these solutions? These are creating new federal agencies and completely changing the administrative structure of a field is a pretty significant change. Are these suggestions really warranted, and will they work? Okay. We'll focus first on the scientific foundations of the field, and I think it will work best if I just give a series of examples of areas where arguably forensic scientists have been giving testimony in court that has not been adequately supported by research. One such area is a currently abandoned method called bullet lead analysis or bullet lead evidence. It was offered initially by the FBI in the late 1960s. So for over 30 years, the FBI did analysis of bullets and tried to identify bullets and determine whether they had come from a particular box of ammunition based upon the elemental composition of the lead alloy in the bullets. This was usually done in cases where a criminal would fire shots at a crime scene, bullet fragments would be identified. Often they were too mangled to be compared directly to a weapon, or no weapon could be found. But a suspect was found who had a box of bullets, and the question was, did this bullet that we found at the crime scene, or perhaps in the body of a victim, did it come from the box of ammunition that our suspect has? And for decades, FBI analysts would analyze the level of certain background elements in the lead alloy, such as silver, antimony, barium, and based on that develop a chemical profile of the bullet. And if the chemical profile of the bullets in the box were sufficiently close to the bullet found at the crime scene, they would say it's a match, and therefore it likely came from this box. Or if they were being cautious, a box manufactured at the same time. And this was treated as very compelling evidence. It was offered in criminal trials more than 2,500 times as testimony, and was used in far more criminal cases, since most criminal cases are resolved through plea bargains and don't go to trial. So this was used for a very long time. In 2004, the National Research Council, prompted by criticisms of this technique, issued a report shown here called Weighing Bullet Lead Evidence that found significant problems with the technique. Not only is there some uncertainty about what it means for the chemical profiles of bullets to match and how the measurements are made and the statistical identifications, but the main problem was that it's not clear what it means if bullets do match, since bullets are manufactured in extremely large batches, huge melts of lead are poured, and there may be millions of bullets manufactured at the same time which might have the same composition. Not only that, nothing is known about how they're distributed, but the assumption is that they may well be distributed through commercial chains together, so that bullets all made at the same time with the same metallic composition may be appearing on the shelves of the same stores in the same towns. So it could well be that everybody in the town who buys 38 caliber bullets has matching bullets, right? Which is not, doesn't support the conclusion that if the bullets match, they very likely came from the suspect's box. All right. So faced with that evidence, the FBI, as of September 2005, abandoned this technique that they'd been using for over 30 years in over 2,500 cases. According to the FBI lab director, Dwight Adams, the decision was, he says, based primarily on the inability of scientists or manufacturers to definitively evaluate the significance of an association between bullets made in the course of bullet lead examination. In other words, we're not going to use the technique anymore because we don't know what it means when we find a match. Well, okay, forgive me for saying so, but perhaps they should have figured this out a little earlier. What the story suggests is, number one, forensic scientists, at least those at the FBI, didn't do a very good job validating this technique before going into court and stating conclusions about it, which turned out not to be scientifically supported. It also raises questions about how well the legal system evaluates and detects evidence. This evidence was being presented a very long time without being effectively challenged in the courts. It was only when some whistleblowers from the FBI raised concerns and it was evaluated by the National Academy that the problems became fully clear. So example number one of a technique that's widely used but maybe not well supported. Second example, fire investigation. There's a really stunning article in the most recent issue of The New Yorker called Trial by Fire that recounts a Texas case. Tragic case in which a Texas man, his house caught on fire and burned down, and in the course of the fire, his 3 young daughters who were in the house were all killed. He'd been there at the time. He managed to get out. This was seen at first as a tragic accident, a terrible event, until the police called in fire investigators to investigate the scene of the fire, and they found significant problems. They ended up concluding that this fire was caused by arson. That accelerants had been used, petrochemical accelerants. So some sort of flammable liquids had been spread around multiple places, and that's why there was a fire. They relied on a series of characteristics that for decades fire investigators have taken to be indicators of an accelerant-driven arson fire, such as crazed glass. If the broken glass at the scene is crazed, it's thought that that's from a very rapid, pattern of cracks in it. That's thought to be from a very rapid change in temperature, which would be characteristic of an accelerant-driven fire and not a naturally occurring fire. Melted steel, it's thought that naturally occurring fires without accelerants don't create enough heat to melt steel. A critical part in the Texas case was that there were multiple V-shaped burn patterns on the wall, sort of narrow at the bottom, bigger at the top, which would suggest, the fire investigators thought, a point of origin of the fire at the base of the walls. And because there were several of these, the usual doctrine in fire investigation is that in a naturally occurring fire, there's usually one of these patterns at the origin of the fire, and it's usually where there's a bad electrical connection, or maybe some child was playing with fire, or maybe a candle fell over, and the fire starts at one point and creates this V-shaped pattern, spreads elsewhere, largely along the ceiling. But if you see multiple V-shaped patterns in multiple places, that suggests the fire set in multiple points at one time, which means arson, they said. And also a pattern of burns on the floor shaped like pools or puddles of liquid, suggesting somebody had maybe poured gasoline or lighter fluid on the floor. All right. All of these, the fire investigators said, were indicators of arson. They were all present. There were other indicators as well. And as a result of this, a young father was convicted of murder of his 3 daughters and was sentenced to death in Texas. Now, the defendant's name was Todd Willingham. Now, the problem with all of this, the conviction was in 1991, is that since that time there have been further studies of fire characteristics which have demonstrated that each and every one of the characteristics treated as evidence of arson in the Willingham case, in fact, can be found in naturally occurring fires. Some of the evidence came from an important study after the Oakland Hills fire about 15 years ago. The fire swept through the Oakland Hills and burned down. This was a brush fire, and it burned down dozens and dozens of houses in Oakland. Fire investigators went in and checked those houses later, and they found crazed glass, melted steel, multiple V-shaped burn patterns, pooling and puddling, and so on. So all of these characteristics that had been treated for years as arson indicators were, in fact, also characteristic of naturally occurring fires. It appeared on further analysis, and there's just been a report recently by a state agency in Texas declaring that there is absolutely no scientific basis for the conclusion that in Mr. Willingham's case, the fire was caused by arson. The conclusion's a bit late since he was executed in 2004. All right. So this is in this month's New Yorker. It's available online. This is a dramatic story that I recommend to you. It's a very well written story. Why did this happen? Well, again, the suggestion is there's testimony by so-called forensic experts that's not very well based on science, and that the legal system isn't doing a good job of policing this. Right? This is passing into the legal system without being adequately challenged. Another example that's been controversial is GSR testing or gunshot residue testing. This is a staple on the CSI television program. Always the CSI guys say, oh, well, he has a GSR in his hand. That proves that he fired a gun. All right? And GSR testing is quite common. But it turns out it's maybe not quite as certain as one would think. There's recent discussion in the academic literature has shown that different criminal investigators in different agencies use very different standards for determining exactly whether GSR is present or not. Some require that there be fused particles of lead, barium, and antimony altogether. Some require just 2 of the 3. Some only 1. How many particles have to be present varies from agency to agency. And so something that could be called GSR in Baltimore might be not GSR in Cleveland. The particles that are supposedly unique to GSR and therefore diagnostic of having fired a gun, turns out are maybe not quite so diagnostic as they thought, and can be associated with other things like brake linings of cars. The most damaging criticism is that the claim that GSR means somebody fired a gun seems to be belied by the fact that there is, in some areas, widespread contamination of gunshot residue particles. And the classic case was in Baltimore, where it turned out the facility where they took suspects to collect GSR samples was downwind of the police firing range. And it turned out, occupational health inspectors discovered that the entire area was contaminated with gunshot residue particles. Now, why didn't the people who were doing gunshot residue testing detect this? I mean, they were not running adequate scientific controls, right? Usually, wouldn't you know your lab was contaminated because your blanks or your control samples showed positive? Well, they weren't running blanks, so they didn't know. The police, I guess, were happy with their performance. They'd say, here's a suspect. Does he have GSR on him? Yes, he does. How about this one? He does too. They were getting high rates of confirmations of GSR on police suspects. But it turns out, the whole facility was contaminated, maybe not so surprising. So innocent people could be contaminated. There's been other studies showing that it's not uncommon, for example, to have GSR contamination in the backseat of police cars. So if the suspect is taken in the police car with his hands handcuffed behind his back, it may well be that they could get GSR that way. So here's a reference to an article I wrote with a Baltimore lawyer who was involved in this, if people are interested. But it's another example of where perhaps the science doesn't fully support the kind of conclusions that have been stated in court. The biggest controversy is about the so-called pattern matching disciplines like latent print analysis or fingerprint comparisons and tool mark identification. These are areas where a fingerprint is left at a crime scene, such as this one. This is a latent print, and is compared to a print from a suspect. Is this a match? Here's a bullet comparison. This part of the comparison is from a bullet left at the scene of a murder in San Francisco. So this is the shell casing ejected from a gun of a bullet that killed somebody in San Francisco. This is a test shell casing that was fired from a Glock 30 automatic owned by a suspect in the case. And an expert looked at it and said, well, we have shearing marks from the firing pin, and I can tell by looking that you see the patterns are pretty darn similar, or at least pretty darn similar enough to be declared a match. And the expert declared that these 2 shell casings were fired by the very same gun, one and the same Glock 30, to the exclusion of all other guns ever manufactured. Well, that's pretty strong. In this case, the expert conclusion of latent print examiners, quite typically, if they draw any conclusion at all, the conclusion is an absolute unique identification. That this latent print was made by the same finger that made this print, to the exclusion of all other fingers of all other people who have ever lived. So very strong conclusions are presented in court routinely about this kind of evidence. And yet, the National Research Council looked at this and found that there was inadequate validation in these pattern matching disciplines, including latent print, tool mark, hair and fiber, bite mark, question documents, and so on. The disciplines where there's some examination of the patterns. The report concluded that with the exception of DNA analysis, no forensic method had been rigorously shown to have the capacity to consistently and with a high degree of certainty demonstrate a connection between evidence and a specific source. In other words, this is pretty diplomatic language, but what they're saying is that testimony that has routinely been presented in court over and over again in case after case for decades is wrong. It's overstated. There's no basis for it, or inadequate basis for it. Now, they're not saying that fingerprint evidence is worthless, but they're saying the conclusion that it can uniquely identify a connection to a specific individual has not been proven to be true. Okay? And the NRC says the simple reality is the interpretation of forensic evidence is not always based on scientific studies to determine its validity. This is a serious problem. Well, I have to agree. I think it's a serious problem. All right. Well, what's different about the pattern matching area from, say, something like DNA? Let's get technical for a minute here. What you're seeing here is DNA profiles from a kind of DNA test called STR analysis. Each of these lines is a sample from a given individual, and this shows genetic characteristics from 3 different genetic locations, or loci, or locations on the human genome. This is one called D3S1358. At this area or locus on the genome, everybody has 2 genetic characteristics called alleles that are inherited from their parents. This particular blood from a crime scene here was found to have within it 2 alleles called 14 and 15, and the position of these peaks on this chart indicate which alleles are present. So the alleles called 14 and 15 from this locus are present in this sample. We can then compare the blood from the crime scene to the blood of several suspects. Suspect 1 has an allele called 17. Could he be the source of the crime scene blood? Nope. The nature of DNA evidence is that we are looking at a specific feature or characteristic of the sample, which everybody has, and we can decide do they match or not. Suspect 1 is excluded. Suspect 2 excluded. Suspect 3 also has the 14 and 15, so he's not excluded. Suspect 4 is excluded. Suspect 3, we can see matches here at 2 other genetic locations, also matches. And so suspect 3, by looking at specific features and seeing they match, we can say this person could be the source. Not only that, but with DNA evidence, we know from extensive research studies exactly how often in various populations we see this characteristic 14 and 15. And these 2 here. So we not only know specifically what to look for to decide whether the samples are potentially the same or not, but we know how rare those features are, and we can quantify it. So the DNA analyst can say, well, we find that the samples have a common set of genetic characteristics, and that set of genetic characteristics would be found in 1 person in a million in the Caucasian population of North America, or something like that. All right. So that's, the National Research Council said, that's pretty good. That's what we want. That's a scientific foundation for a conclusion. As compared with latent print analysis, where, there are a number of different characteristics that can be examined, ridge endings, bifurcations, and so on, but no particular set is examined in every case. The expert looks at what's available and tries to decide what's relevant in this one, and then looks over here and sees, do I find it? Do I find something similar? Yeah, if we look in here, you can see something that looks kind of like this center area here. or similar enough. There's no standard for which things are examined or how many of them have to match before the expert concludes that the same finger made both samples. It's an entirely subjective judgment made in kind of an impressionistic way by somebody who is trained as an expert in this discipline. But they can't specify any particular set of features or number of features that need to be identified before declaring a match, nor do they have research that shows how rare the collective set of matching features are for the prints. Same thing is true for the pattern matching analysis. How many, this line seems to match. I mean, how close does it have to be called a match, and how many matching features do you need? Completely unspecified and left to the judgment of the individual expert. And according to the NRC report, that's just not adequate. Certainly we know that there have been errors, although experts in this area often testify with great certainty to unique identification. These particular prints I use for a purpose. The latent print on the right is from this case. It's the Spanish train bombing in Madrid when was this? 2005, I believe. A very serious case. The print on the left is from this man, Brandon Mayfield, a lawyer in Portland, Oregon, who was arrested for involvement in the Spanish train bombing, a terrorist act, and was held in custody for 2 weeks before Spanish authorities found another suspect, an Algerian alleged terrorist, who they found actually matched this latent print better than Mr. Mayfield. And this was a high-profile fingerprinting error. So the claim that these techniques are infallible, which is often made, certainly doesn't seem to be true. Experts have continued to claim they're infallible by saying that, well, they're infallible if done by a competent person, and anybody who makes a mistake is by definition incompetent, and therefore competent people are still infallible. But it was hard to argue that after the Mayfield case, since it involved 3 of the top latent print examiners at the FBI lab, which is thought to be the premier forensic lab in the world, and a confirmation by an expert hired by the defendant, who also. So 4 very high-profile, well-known experts got this one wrong. All right. Now, why do these things happen? Another issue raised by the National Research Council beyond lack of adequate validation of the techniques is what the report called failure to control observer effects. Observer effects are sometimes called expectation effects. This is an issue which is particularly interesting to me as someone trained as a psychologist, because it involves a psychological issue. That is, that the tendency of human beings to interpret data in a manner that's consistent with their expectations or prior theories. Now, it turns out we all, according to psychologists, tend to do this. If we have strong expectations for what we are about to see or should be seeing or what we want to see, we tend to be more likely to see that. So, and this is most influential when we're evaluating data that are somewhat ambiguous, and when we're motivated to find a particular result, we tend to be more likely to find it on the same data. So there's a human tendency to respond to context in a way that influences our judgment. And the critique made of forensic science by the National Research Council is that forensic scientists in general have not done enough to control for these problems. Right? In many areas of science, efforts are made to control for human bias, such as in medical testing, where new drug trials are often run in a blind or double-blind way. So there are placebo controls, and people don't know whether neither the patient nor the doctor knows who's receiving the true drug or the placebo, just so that their own expectations don't influence them. In forensic science, though, forensic scientists often have very strong expectations that they bring with them when they look at data. All right, here's a a few quick slides to make the point. Psychologists like to show these kind of slides to make the point that how we interpret ambiguous data can be influenced by our expectations. So start by looking at the picture of this is like a crude drawing of a human face, right? Is that? Does it look like a face? How about now? Is it still a face? Kind of? Still a face? All right. What do we see now? It's degrading, but it's still sort of a face. You can kind of keep getting it. All right. Now let's look at a different image. This, I'll be salacious here. This is a naked woman. You see this is a naked woman? She's still naked? Even now, you can kind of see, it's more Picasso-like, but you're still seeing the naked woman, right? And now? Still? And now? All right. So, now, all right. So, at some point you looked at this image and this image, and while looking at this one, presumably most of you were thinking, all right, a face, maybe not a great face. And here we're still thinking, kind of cute. Or something. All right, so this is the point. So basically, psychologists have done studies like this thousands of times. If you have a series of what we call ambiguous figures like this, if you start on this end and start showing this picture and then ask people, what do you see, what do you see, what do you see, and what's this? Most people will say face. If you start here and say, what do you see, what do you see, what do you see, and what's this? Most people will say nude figure. In fact, if you start with a nude figure and get over here and say, what's this, a nude figure? Could it be a face? They say, well, what are you talking about? It's not a face. It's a nude figure. And vice versa. All right. The context influences what we see. This looks like ABC, but this looks like 12, 13, 14, even though it's the same thing, right? So what we expect influences how we interpret the data of the world. Okay. Well, the point, though, is that drawing this back to forensic scientists often have very strong expectations as to what they'll see before they look at that latent print and do the comparison. I have a collection of lab notes and transmittal memos to forensic scientists that sort of give some indication of what they're thinking as they're doing the analysis. Here's some of my favorites from DNA lab notes. This one from a Virginia case. The analyst writes, Diabato, who's the prosecutor, left a message stating this S is the suspect, or the subject. This S is suspected in other rapes, but they can't find the V, victim. Need this case to put S away. All right. So this is the mindset of the person who's about to look at what could be an ambiguous result. Here's one from our local Orange County crime lab. I thought this was particularly good. Suspect, known Crip gang member, keeps skating on charges, never serves time. This robbery, he gets hit in the head with a bar stool, left a blood trail. Miller, who's the deputy DA, wants to connect this guy to the scene with DNA. Well, pretty strong expectations as to what we'll see. This is from an LA case where the defendant's lawyer was suggesting that another person might have been involved, another specific individual whose sample is item 57 might have been involved. And the analyst writes, death penalty case, need to eliminate item 57 as a possible suspect. Well, okay. So there's the analysts are in direct communication with the detectives. They know what they expect to see, perhaps what they hope to see. And the claim is that this may cause them to resolve ambiguous data in a manner consistent with their expectations, or miss or disregard evidence of problems, or miss or disregard alternative interpretations of the data, thereby undermining the scientific validity of their conclusions. This is a point that I've made in some academic writings, and a point that I was pleased to see the National Research Council picked up on. Going back to the Mayfield case, these prints, one of the explanations put forward by the FBI for the error in the Mayfield case was a psychological issue, which they called confirmation bias. The initial examiner who looked at the case was a highly respected supervisor. The next two examiners who looked at the case knew that he'd called a match, so what were they going to say? The subsequent examinations, to disagree was not an expected response. Well, okay. But it suggests that the procedures used for interpretation then are influenced by these psychological factors that can lead to bias. Okay. All right. Now this was shown further by a very clever study done by a scientist named E.T.L. Dror and some of his colleagues. Dror is a German who is now an academic and was at the time at Southampton University in England and is now at London University. Dror did a very clever thing. After the Mayfield case, which got a lot of publicity, he went out and he gathered fingerprints, latent print images and the 10 print comparisons that had been compared by well-established, distinguished fingerprint examiners and declared a match. So he went through their previous case records and pulled out fingerprint comparisons that they had previously concluded were a match and had testified were a match. He then took the ones that they had previously, he took 5 different analysts, examiners, he took prints that they had previously determined to be a match, and he showed them the same prints, and he said, take a look at these, would you? These are the prints that were compared by the FBI in the Mayfield case, and tell us if you think that these really match or not. Okay? So here the context has changed from one in which they're expecting to find a match to one in which they're expecting to find not a match, because they already know it's been well publicized that Mr. Mayfield has been released and it was all a mistake. And so, not surprising, one out of the 5 continued to say it was a match, but the other 4 changed their identification. So looking at prints that they themselves had said were a match before, now with the suggestion that they shouldn't match, are saying they don't match. Okay. Well, so the suggestion is there's a level of subjectivity and influence which allows context to have an influence. And that forensic scientists, the National Research Council suggests, have not done enough to deal with the potential for what they call cognitive and contextual biases. So the National Research Council report says, I think appropriately enough, forensic disciplines that rely on subjective judgment, and that's most of them, need to develop rigorous protocols to guide these subjective interpretations and pursue equally rigorous research and evaluation programs. I think I strongly agree. And to date, there's no good evidence that the forensic science community has made a sufficient effort to address the bias issue. So more needs to be done in this area. What could be done? In my writings, I've suggested a number of different approaches. One is just separating laboratory functions so that one person talks to the detectives and finds out who the detectives really think is guilty, but the person who does the comparisons doesn't know which ones are supposed to match and which ones have which source. Another suggestion we call sequential unmasking is a procedure where the evidentiary item, say the latent print, is examined and characterized without knowing what the comparison print looks like. So the examiners decide what are the important features in the latent print before looking to see whether the suspect has those features. It's interesting that in the Mayfield case, there were some discrepancies between that latent print, which was kind of smudged and fuzzy, and Mr. Mayfield's print. But they were dismissed as unimportant by the FBI examiners who thought they might have been caused by an overlay of another print or something like that. Well, they decided that they were unimportant only after seeing that Mr. Mayfield didn't have those characteristics. Right? And so there's kind of a circularity to the reasoning that is part of the cognitive biases. There are procedures that can be used by sequencing work to avoid that kind of problem. Another possibility is doing evidence lineup so that the analyst is given a series of different prints and said, which one of these, if any, match this other one, so they don't know which one's supposed to match or not. This has raised some interesting legal issues. This is one of the issues I've been interested in, which is, in light of these issues and the failure of forensic scientists to deal with them, what should be the attitude of the legal system toward forensic evidence that's subject to these biases? Should courts require that analysts use more rigorous interpretation procedures, such as those called for by the National Research Council before admitting the evidence? Courts haven't done that so far, but arguably might be a good idea. All right. Now, another area, so I'll just go through a final area that has been raised about problems in forensic science, and that is scientific misconduct. In some ways, I think this is not the most important issue. There are, I think issues about lack of validation and lack of rigorous procedure for interpretation are the major issues in the area. But there have been repeated episodes of misconduct in forensic science. People talk about the bad apples. Yeah, there are some bad apples. And they involve things like knowingly presenting false or exaggerated testimony. So, cases where the analyst hasn't actually, done the work and claims that he has. One famous bad analyst, Fred Zane in West Virginia, was known as the analyst who could find results when no one else could. He was sort of the analyst's last resort. It turned out he was able to do that because he made them up. Falsification of scientific findings has been common, not always to frame somebody. Sometimes analysts, this has been particularly true in the DNA area, which I study most, analysts falsify scientific findings to cover up their own problems. So the analysts may accidentally contaminate some of the samples in an assay. Rather than redo it, they just kind of cover up the fact, thinking, I probably got it right, and if the control failed because I spilled something, well, I don't have to redo it. And so there's falsification of controls has been a consistent problem in the DNA area, usually by analysts, I think, who are under pressure to perform rapidly, and they cut corners. Intentional failure to follow correct procedures sometimes arises from the same thing. I mentioned analysts falsifying controls in some cases. The analyst in the Houston Police Department crime lab dealt with the problem of control failure in a very innovative way. They didn't run controls. Right, so you don't have to worry about your controls failing and having to redo experiments if you just don't have controls. Right? So cutting corners to save time in ways that undermine the scientific validity of the work. These seem to be fairly common problems. The Houston case was an egregious example of this. I became involved somewhat in this scandal. I was asked by a television station in Houston, KHOU, if I would review some DNA casework that they'd done, compare the transcripts of what the expert was saying in court with the underlying laboratory notes and test results to see if experts were presenting their results in a correct way. And they sent me a whole series of cases, and I found out the answer was no. I mean, not only were they exaggerating the findings and saying wrong things, but in many cases they were saying things that did not correspond to what the underlying data said. So this led to further investigations in Houston by independent auditors and by a scientific review panel, which confirmed that this lab had been using, this particular lab, the Houston Police Department Crime Lab, and their DNA serology unit had been using poor scientific practices for over a decade. Nobody knew. They were going into court and testifying with great certainty, but they weren't following correct scientific procedures. They were routinely giving misleading testimony. For example, they computed the statistics in their DNA cases wrong in virtually every case, greatly exaggerating the statistical certainty of their findings. There was, the auditors found dry labbing in some cases, particularly drug cases. Dry labbing means you don't actually perform the experiments or assays. You just report the results. Right? So nothing gets wet, right? It's all very clean, neat, quick. And you can jump to the expected conclusion without the inconvenience of actually having to do lab work. Misrepresentation of credentials and qualifications. They were claiming they had Ph.D.s when they didn't. Suppression of exculpatory evidence. So the lab might run 3 DNA tests, and some of them would support inclusion of the suspect, others would not, so they would just report the ones that included him, not the ones that presented the different result. All right, so the inadequate facilities. The picture is from the Houston Crime Lab, which one of the problems in this lab was that they had a leaking roof. They were on the top floor of a downtown office building in Houston, and every time it rained, and it rains a lot in Houston, water would come pouring through the roof because the roof leaked. And there's a long story as to why it was that the roof leaked and why they couldn't get it repaired after years and years and years. And it had something to do with the fact that the roofing contractor was the brother-in-law of the mayor. And so there's a political corruption angle to this. But the net result was, this is a lab. When I visited the lab, they had these tarpaulins hanging from the ceiling this Rube Goldberg arrangement with tarps that were connected to garden hoses that would run down into wastebaskets, which they would then carry out and dump. And they were so habituated to this, as it's not really a problem. I mean, it's really only like mist, and it only falls on the top of the lab benches. And when it starts to rain, we put our work in the drawers, and but it was a problem. This lab had 2 known false convictions where they falsely convicted people when their work was redone. In many cases, there were retest inconsistencies. That is, the retest didn't match the first test, even though it didn't prove the defendant innocent. It wasn't the same result as the Houston lab reported. Those of you who are interested, there's a website, hpdlabinvestigation.org, which gives the report of the independent auditor that reviewed the work, and it's pretty eye-opening. All right. All of this has had implications for wrongful convictions as well. These are some results from an article published in Science in late 2005, an analysis of cases where DNA evidence has exonerated somebody who had been convicted and sentenced to prison. So these are DNA exoneration cases. And the effort of the researchers was to figure out what were the factors that contributed to the false conviction. That is, how did this person, proven innocent later by DNA, how did they get convicted in the first place? What were the factors in the case that explained the false conviction? The top item, eyewitness errors, was present in 71% of the cases, and far and away that was the most important factor. But surprisingly, and we're seeing this with more analyses, problems in forensic science were right up there too. So forensic science testing errors, 63% of the cases. Down here, false or misleading testimony by forensic scientists, 27% of the cases. So a pretty high percentage of these cases, and these are cases where we know somebody's been falsely convicted, problems in forensic science seem to be playing a role. And I think this is, I think it doesn't prove how prevalent these problems are in run-of-the-mill cases, but certainly it suggests that they have been a problem. There's another recent article in the Virginia Law Review in 2009 by Brandon Garrett and Peter Neufeld that does a much more extensive analysis of these exoneration cases and shows a pretty high rate of forensic scientists saying things that are not scientifically well supported. So all of this, I think, contributed to the National Research Council's recommendation that things need to be changed. There are problems in forensic science. It's a very important field of human endeavor. We have to have scientific evidence that helps us solve crime. Forensic science is very important, and it's important that we do it well. So the National Research Council said, but we've got problems. What can we do about it? Their recommendations, I think, are based on the notion that the problems are systemic in the sense that we need to sort of change the whole structure in which forensic science is done. Forensic science has largely been done in crime labs that are run by police agencies. So it's police personnel who are doing the scientific work, and often they come out of a police culture and not a scientific culture. That needs to be changed, said the NRC. So one suggestion was the creation of a new federal agency, the National Institute of Forensic Science, which would, they said, establish standard terminology for reporting, fund validation research competitively. So give out money to do the validation that needs to be done, fund research on observer bias, sources of human error, develop QA and QC, quality assurance and quality control procedures, establish a national code of ethics, and so on. So a federal agency should be created, they said, which would take the lead in providing oversight and setting best practice standards for the field. Okay, that would be one way to do it. Removing all public forensic laboratories from administrative control of law enforcement is another suggestion. Again, this would be a pretty dramatic change, given that almost all of them are now in the control of law enforcement. But the NRC suggested that part of the reason that forensic science is in the state it's in now is that it's operated by law enforcement officials who simply have not put a priority on validation, analytic rigor, and accuracy of testimony. That the priority has been on producing testimony helpful to criminal prosecutions, not on analytically rigorous forensic science. All right. Establishing mandatory accreditation of forensic laboratories and certification of analysts is another suggestion. And further developing the educational and university infrastructure in forensic science, so that forensic science can be more of an academic science and not just a police science. This raises a number of policy issues that I think we all need to think about as citizens. In this time of financial crisis, the question of whether we really need a new federal agency is a pressing one. Certainly, from my point of view, it would be desirable and would in fact help address some of the systemic problems that I agree exist. But creating a new federal agency to take on this problem, sort of federalizing the problem, is a major step. Do we really need to do that? Do we really need to separate forensic science from the control of law enforcement? Most forensic scientists hate this idea. Traditionally, forensic scientists have gained funding and have gained political leverage by kind of, hitching their wagon to the law enforcement team. So those who have support from police agencies generally do better in getting funding, and they think the association with law enforcement helps them, because in times of budget crisis, when there's a question of who gets funded and who doesn't, those who are associated with law enforcement, because it's seen as a priority, do better. Well, whether this continues to be true in the CSI era, I think is worth asking. But so asking whether we really need to take that step is important, because it will be strongly resisted. Another issue is whether existing institutions can solve the problem. And the main argument against this has been that they haven't addressed these problems so far. The professional societies in forensic science have established accreditation and certification schemes. Accreditation is to accredit laboratories to assure labs meet certain standards. And I think that's very helpful, and probably would have. The Houston crime lab that was so bad was not an accredited laboratory, and I think accreditation of that laboratory certainly would have helped. Certification of analysts can assure their competence. Accreditation and certification, although important, don't seem to address the issue of lack of validation of forensic science fields. We've had accreditation of latent print laboratories and tool marking laboratories. So there's been accreditation in the very fields that the National Research Council says aren't adequately validated, and certification of analysts in these fields. And so if the issue is whether the whole field has an inadequate foundation, having people within the field certify and accredit each other may not be the right answer. Another question is what role the judicial system should be playing in policing forensic science. As I've alluded to, the judicial system has a pretty poor record in this area so far. And one can actually read this National Research Council report, not just as a critique of forensic science, but as a critique of the judicial system of lawyers and judges. Because lawyers and judges are supposed to be screening evidence in criminal cases to make sure it's reliable. There are even standards for admissibility of scientific evidence that require that it be generally accepted or that it be meet certain standards of reliability. So the courts, in theory, have strong standards for the admissibility of scientific evidence, which standards don't seem to have kept out of court a lot of the evidence that's now seen as problematic. All right, so maybe the judicial system needs to be doing more. The NRC was pretty, I thought they were pretty, they were diplomatic, but they said some pretty harsh things about the judicial system. That, while forensic science has not done nearly as much as it could to establish the validity of its approaches, courts have been utterly ineffective at addressing this problem. And so, to the extent the National Research Council has highlighted a problem, it is not just a problem with crime labs and forensic science. It's a problem more broadly with our judicial system and the ability of lawyers and judges to adequately understand and evaluate scientific evidence. Now, the NRC thought it was sort of hopeless, saying judicial review by itself will not cure the infirmities of the forensic science community. The NRC favored a more systemic approach. I'm hopeful that maybe the report will help judges wake up to some of the problems. So finally, what should California be doing? National politics control what's likely to happen at the national level. Whether we'll ever have a NIFS, National Institute of Forensic Science, probably is well down the agenda behind whether we'll have healthcare reform and deal with other national issues. In the meantime, should the states be doing anything? It turns out 16 states have done something, have established state-level oversight commissions on forensic science. So one issue is whether California should take a step in that direction. These oversight commissions take different forms. Some, like Texas, look just into scientific misconduct, and it was a Texas commission that issued the recent devastating report in the Willingham case about the arsons. Others set best practice standards and actually bring in panels of academic scientists to advise on how labs should carry out their work. Virginia has taken this approach, and the Virginia Forensic Science Board has in fact been taking steps to require the labs to update its protocols. One of the things Virginia did just within the last month is issue new protocols that required analysts, when interpreting certain forensic test results in the DNA area, to use blinded protocols. Right? So, which, from my point of view, is a major advance. So, should California be moving in this direction? There is a California Crime Laboratory Review Task Force, which was appointed by our legislature to look into this problem. I've been one of 16 members of that task force. And speaking just for myself, not for the task force, I think that this task force is likely to recommend to the legislature that there be a state-level advisory body on forensic science in California to do things like evaluate and recommend better use of resources in forensic science. Where could we get the most bang for the buck as far as creating and supporting forensic science facilities, investigating allegations of serious negligence and misconduct. At this point, the district attorneys' offices and police agencies that run the labs often also do the investigations of alleged misconduct, creating potential for at least the appearance of conflict of interest. Having a statewide body charged with doing that, such as the one in Texas, would be a good. Standardizing, reporting, and improving communications among agencies, and making evaluations for training and education. All of these could be statewide functions, and from my point of view, it would be something California should be. Whether the legislature will see that as a priority is another issue to be determined. In any event, there are many policy issues to be considered, a lot of important issues to be discussed, but the National Research Council, through its report, has done, I think, a major service in alerting us to some problems and letting us know that there's a gap between what we see in CSI and what we would ideally like to see in the courtroom. our efforts as informed citizens to know about this and to support reform where needed will be part of bringing about a change so that the CSI in reality can live up to its high and important image on television. So let me stop at this point and take a few minutes for questions. Sure. Thank you. Okay, yes, you had... Yeah, so her question is, aren't latent prints computerized through an APHIS system? And I should mention one of my colleagues, Simon Cole, who is one of the leading experts on fingerprint identification, is in the audience here and could probably talk to you about it afterwards. But yes, the latent prints can be computerized, that is digitized, and then by computer compared against databases consisting of reference samples. And that was, in fact, how Brandon Mayfield was identified, and the latent print. So he was identified. But the way these computer systems work, it's not the computer itself that makes the identification. The computer simply identifies sets of prints that have similar features. The identification is always done by an analyst who, having been told by the computer, here are 5 or here are 10 that look likely, the analyst then goes through and examines it very closely to see if it's a match. So it's not the computer is making suggestions. I think it may be the computers may be relevant because it's now possible to search a latent against millions and millions of prints in these databases, which may increase the likelihood of finding 2 prints of different people that are very similar, right? I mean, it used to be that you would compare the print found at the crime scene against the 10 print cards that the police happened to have of all the usual suspects, and maybe the analyst doing it manually would compare the latent print against a dozen other prints or a couple dozen or 100. The likelihood of finding prints from different people that are very, very similar would be relatively low there, whereas if you're looking at millions, the chances of finding somebody very close enough to be mistaken, that they could be mistaken for being the same person, may be a lot higher. And so this may be an area where the subjective judgment of the analyst hasn't caught up with the increase in computing power that makes finer judgments necessary, and of course further complicates and problematizes the claim of analysts to be able to identify things uniquely, right? Maybe you can be highly confident in your identification if you're comparing a particular latent to 10 different people, but if you're comparing it to 1 million different people, maybe you can't be so sure as you thought you were. Again, this is an area where research is needed. Yes.
Well, we learned that 99.99% of us are all the same, and so how good is DNA testing? I mean, if they're that close, the difference between people are tough.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics, and this is actually something I've written about quite a bit, which is the potential for ambiguity in DNA testing. Now, I have to say, DNA tests DNA tests can extract a tremendous amount of information. Although 99.9% of our DNA is the same, the tests examine certain areas of the genome that are polymorphic, that is, where there's variation among individuals. And the loci that are chosen for examination are those that are known to be variable among people. And we know how variable they are because studies have been done that look at the frequency of various possible characteristics in different populations. So we have some idea of the variability. Now, my opinion is if one gets a complete DNA profile, so if one examines, the standard approach is to examine 13 to 16 different genetic locations. And if you find complete information on 13 to 16 locations and with single source samples and you find a clean match, That's darn good evidence, very convincing. Unless you have a twin brother, it's probably yours. The problem arises is that in some cases, the analysts are not able to get complete information from the evidentiary sample. Maybe it's old or degraded or very limited in quantity. And so often the evidentiary DNA profile will be only partially there. Information will be missing. And that creates an area of ambiguity, because if you get a mismatch, is it a mismatch because you have a problem in your assay, limitations of your assay, or is it a mismatch because it's a different person? It can be further complicated because often the DNA samples found at crime scenes are mixtures of DNA from more than one person. So if you have incomplete profiles from multiple people, you can often get a fairly complicated set of characteristics that where it's experts can differ about whether it should be called a match or not. Now, what I've been arguing for in my academic writings is that those cases need to be approached very carefully and rigorously. The interpretation of the evidence sample has to be done entirely, completely, before you look at what the reference sample is. And I've written articles about how I think analysts can go awry in some of these cases where they kind of peek at what the suspect has while looking at the ambiguous evidence and say, oh, well, okay, should I treat this as an allele or not? Oh, the suspect has it, so I'll count it. And how about this? Is this an allele? Oh, the suspect doesn't have it, so I guess it's not a true result. And so by picking and choosing among findings in that way, I think a DNA analyst could potentially go wrong. It's part of the cases in Houston where the analysts reached the wrong results. There were a couple of DNA cases that falsely incriminated people. Were partly because the analysts had strong expectations about what they should be seeing that clouded their judgment. So these cognitive and psychological issues continue to be important, even in the DNA area.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yes?
Can you comment on the recent publication about the synthesis of DNA fragments?
Yes. I mean, that was very interesting within the last couple of weeks. So the question is, can I comment on the recent publication, which was it in Science or Nature? I can't remember. So a major scientific publication carried an article about the synthesis of forensic DNA profiles that argued that it's possible argued in effect it would be possible for criminals to synthesize a DNA profile, perhaps to throw police off the trail or to falsely incriminate somebody. Now, my reaction to that, well, in the first place, if you wanted to frame somebody by, mislead the police by, putting somebody's DNA at the crime scene, it would be much easier to take, known biological samples from them, their hair, or give them a Coke and a smile and keep the glass. It would be, it's possible to take samples of people's DNA and using PCR techniques replicate it and create amplicons, that is amplified DNA product for the various loci that are examined in DNA tests, and spread that around at a crime scene. And you could do that based on the original biological samples. One wouldn't need DNA synthesis to do that. And in fact, there have been some studies. I was a referee for a master's thesis from an Australian forensic science graduate student who, as part of her master's thesis, was examining whether one could falsify DNA results by taking samples from known people, running them through the amplification process, and then spraying around this amplified DNA at a fake crime scene with a spray atomizer. And the answer is yes, you could do that. I mean, so that could already be done without synthesis. The ability to synthesize DNA, adds to the potential capabilities of nefarious people to do misleading things. So if you happen to know, Arnold Schwarzenegger's DNA profile, you could synthesize his DNA and plant it at your next crime scene. But it would probably be easier to pick up some of his DNA from his discarded chewing gum than to synthesize this DNA. What it highlights is that I think with any new technology for fighting crime, there's always a kind of an arms race between those in society who want to use the technology to protect us, police and forensic scientists, and those those in the criminal community who want to evade that technology. We saw it when automobiles were first created. There was a lot of car theft, so we developed ignition locks, and then criminals learned how to defeat the ignition locks, and so on. There's been one of our colleagues has written about the kind of criminal arms race involving safecrackers. People, the manufacturers of safes and people who break into safes have, over the years have had a kind of a back and forth with criminals continually becoming more sophisticated about how to defeat the crime control technology. It wouldn't be surprising at all to see that kind of thing happen with DNA testing, and it wouldn't surprise me to see sophisticated criminals developing techniques designed to evade DNA testing. That's a problem. I'm not sure we've seen it yet. Possibly they have, and it hasn't been detected. That's one of those problems we'll have to deal with when it arises. The nice part about the article in Science was that they had not only did they show that it was possible to do this DNA synthesis, but they developed a set of tests to detect or distinguish synthesized DNA from real DNA, which may point to the next level of control technology. But all right.